Good afternoon, and welcome to the 15th Annual Wesley Literary Tea. I'm Pastor Dan King CREDE, and I'm so glad that you can be with us this afternoon, even though this event cannot be in person this year. That means, of course, that we'll be providing the books and the reviews, but you have to get yourself a cup of tea, some coffee, or a mug of hot chocolate, and your own cookies. William Long said, "Literature preserves the ideals of a people, and ideals, love, faith, duty, friendship, freedom, reverence, are the part of human life most worthy of preservation." I hope you enjoy the contemporary authors and the reviewers who come to share with you this day.
Where do we go from here? Annette and I would like to welcome you to this, the 15th Annual Wesley Literary Tea. Wesley has sponsored these teas since January 2006 and has solicited our friends and members to review books important to our history as a country, a church, and as part of this worldwide home we share with all its inhabitants. Marcia Eischen conceived the idea that this would be a good opportunity to introduce books that address topics of interest and to give the books a thumbs up, down, or in the middle. The goal was to widen our collective knowledge of this earth and its people. This year is different from the last 14 years in that we can't meet in person but must join electronically because of the constraints of the pandemic that is disrupting so much of the world. Our usual partners in the tea side of the event, our Wesley United Methodist Women, cannot provide us with cookies and tea today, but they are here electronically. We want to thank all of you who have helped with and attended events in the past and in this year's event. As we look at the theme, we hope everyone will think deeply about this question and how to answer it. Where do we go from here? Here we are, a year into a pandemic that has disrupted all of our lives. One that over 99% of the people alive today have never experienced. On top of the pandemic, we have seen a series of police encounters with the public that have left us stunned and questioning about our relationships with each other and the agencies we have entrusted to enforce our laws. We have watched our elected officials be hamstrung by political bickering at a time when a unifying, cooperative spirit was needed. The result has been the disastrous response by the most powerful and richest nation in the world to the pandemic. We should have been able to mount the best response. We instead did a very bad job of addressing the challenge. Worldwide, 1.8 million people, including 340,000 Americans, have died from the COVID-related disease in 2020. This pandemic has not abated in the first weeks of 2021, and the deaths in America have risen above 370,000 people. The pandemic, the questionable killing of citizens by police, and the destructive political fighting has gotten our attention. Hopefully, some of these books today will help us understand how we got where we are and how we might constructively come out of the experience into a better world. The vaccines are here. There is hope in controlling the virus, but much remains to be done to heal our nation and world. In the week since I wrote these words that I just spoke, we must add another major concern. Our capital in Washington, D.C., has been invaded by a deadly mob egged on by our sitting president. We must come together as a nation and solve our problems. 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World by Fareed Zakaria, written in 2020. Fareed Zakaria is the author of 2 books, The Post-American World and The Future of Freedom, both well-received books. He is host of a CNN show, Fareed Zakaria GPS, a program addressing international affairs, and is a columnist for the Washington Post. This book takes us from our recent past to our current situation to look at where our difficulties lie in defeating this virus and other challenges we face in this future. The author details our current situation in a globally connected world with a checkered past. The multiple economic, cultural, and political divisions in this country and the world are reviewed along with the role pandemics have played in the written history of the world. Our current worst enemy, according to Zakaria, is viral disease. While our efforts are designed for preparation for war with each other, America alone has an annual $750 billion defense budget, while the entire world's collective approach to biological weapons has only 4 employees with a budget of less than a typical McDonald's. That is the Biological Weapons Convention. Neither political party has performed well in this pandemic in America, and globally, both right and left-wing governments have had good and bad outcomes in fighting the virus. The portion of the GDP of countries devoted to healthcare does not correlate with the success of the individual countries. For example, Hong Kong devotes 18% of its GDP to healthcare, and France 54%. Hong Kong did a very good job of controlling the spread. France, like the USA, has not. Our response to this pandemic is not one of an isolated event unrelated to our current situation as a country and world. China bungled its initial response to the virus by covering it up and then addressing it with coercive measures locally and only partial truths with the rest of the world. WHO believed China and declared in January of 2020 that this was not an airborne spread disease. Our president, by his own words, was informed of the serious nature of the illness early on, yet told everyone that it was a passing, mild disease because he didn't want to upset the people. We came into the pandemic with a troubled, fractious government divided over the role of the federal government. The right wing in the past 40 years, according to Zachariah, has been run mostly by people who openly pledge to destroy the very government they lead, while the left-wing politicians have added layers upon layers of bureaucracy and regulation. Under JFK, each cabinet department had 17 layers of appointees. By the time Trump took office, there were a staggering 71 layers. The author cites several major problems contributing to this situation. Number one, patronage. For example, banking has 5 or 6 different congressional committees overseeing banking with different rules. The members of these committees are heavily dependent upon these same banks for campaign monies. Rules favorable to the banks are then written by the committees according to the donations. That's patronage. Number 2, red tape. Bureaucracy has created a vetocracy, V-E-T-O-C-R-A-C-Y, according to Francis Fukuyama. Any one of several groups can stop any major government progress and program. Number 3, there is a major division in our country between college-educated and high school or less educated people. This has translated into a city versus rural political divide. Zachariah feels cities will thrive post-pandemic, countryside not so much. Number 4, we are still experiencing the after effects of the financial crisis of 2008. The remedy that the government made for this crisis was to fund banking and Wall Street. This significantly widened the income and wealth gap. Big companies in manufacturing and service are increasing productivity, whereas smaller ones are not. Big companies have grown 33% and 44% respectively, whereas the small companies 7% and 5%. The large companies have the funding to sustain themselves. Incomes earned by the top 1% were less than 10% of the total income in the United States in 1970, but had risen to greater than 20% by 2019. The bottom 50% garnered 22% of income in 1970, but now only 15%. At this point, surprising to me, Zachariah quotes Matthew. For everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have abundance. But for him who has not, even what he has will be taken away. Zachariah sees this time as a crisis that must be addressed by all of us and without delay. He is concerned that if not addressed, revolution may occur. I strongly recommend this book. It's even-handed, reads easily, gives a concise and clear history on how we got here, and is cautiously hopeful that America can again find its way in the world. Post-World War II, America led the world in many good ways with the UN, World Bank, Berlin Airlift, Marshall Plan as examples. The United States has made many missteps in the past 75 years, but overall was considered a force for good by the rest of the world. Only in the past few years has our country ever been considered by others as deserving pity. The events in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021 should make everyone aware of the necessity for all of us to come together as a united American people and citizens of the world to rationally face and solve the problems facing us. Failure to do so may lead to problems not imaginable only recently. This is how I interpret Zachariah's message. Thank you.
The author of the book I'm reviewing on corruption in America and what is at stake is Sarah Chase. She spent a decade analyzing how corrupt systems are organized and operate. Chase speaks from a place of expertise on Nigeria, Egypt, and Central America, as well as in Afghanistan, where she was an advisor on corruption issues to U.S. commanders. She dissected corruption on 4 continents and discovered obvious patterns that in turn lead to problems like terrorism and environmental crises. Corruption is defined as an operating system of sophisticated networks in which government officials, and that includes all 3 branches and their agencies, along with key private sector interests and out-and-out criminals, interweave. Their main objective is to maximize returns for network members. Corruption is when people in power use their power to capture the community's sources of money. Money has become the most important social measuring rod. The first index to judging a person is money, and enough has nothing to do with it. It becomes a race between rivals with no finish line. What matters is ever-growing wealth. These networks cut across political parties and have grown beyond our national boundaries. No one doubts that there's some corruption in America, as there is in every other country. But Chase contends that the U.S. is showing symptoms distressingly similar to those of the most corrupt countries in the world. Corruption does not happen in a vacuum, nor is it attributed to a single scandal. She gives examples of how corrupt networking systems are organized, how they enforce the rules so that crimes are rarely punished, how they are overlooked and downplayed, shrugged off with a roll of the eyes by the richer and better educated, and how they shape our government, affecting the outcome of elections and tanking the economy. The catalyst for Chase to analyze what was happening in the U.S. was a Supreme Court case in 2016, McDonald versus the U.S. It was a pretty clear-cut case of bribery. The governor of Virginia, Bob McDonnell, accepted luxury gifts and personal financial help from a businessman in exchange for the governor's sway over state agencies to promote, legitimatize, and endorse the company's product. Bob McDowell was convicted of bribery, but his case was appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously to overturn the bribery conviction. The court's opinion examined how we do politics, analyzing the types of interactions that routinely happen between government officials and members of the public. Letting the McDonnell opinion stand, they reasoned, would mean criminalizing politics because that is how politics is currently practiced. Bribery convictions fell by 1/3, and prison sentences were reduced to half of the minimum sentencing guidelines. The damaging effects of decisions like McDonnell is the implied blessing bestowed on a range of corrupt practices. One of the purposes for punishment for crimes is to broadcast to the entire community where it draws the line, what is acceptable behavior, and what is found to be wrong. In the United States, serious and damaging corruption is not getting punished because we deem it to be okay. Chase analyzes these dangerous networks of corruption throughout America's past, present, and possible future. There are examples dating back to biblical times right up to the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Although the book does move in a mostly chronological order, the timeline is interrupted with chapters on specific topics, which makes the reading choppy. We are familiar with corruption, things like bribery, price fixing, tax evasion, fraud, cronyism, paybacks, etc. Reading this book, however, reminded me of these things, and it heightened my awareness of white-collar crimes. It made a point of the importance of corruption within a framework of a networking system, with examples like trading favors and bailing each other out of trouble. I had not previously viewed corruption within the context of a networking system, and an example the author gave was that of Jeffrey Epstein and the system that surrounded to protect him. Chase highlights a variety of other methods used by corrupt systems, like paring down their associates, switching their links, reconfiguring their systems. The most common and effective tactic to defeat a network's opposition is to divide and pit groups of the population against one another. Humans break into groups, and then they bristle with mistrust at anyone branded to be other. Various methods used by corrupt systems are secrecy, using big words, drowning people in details, jumbling unlike things together, downplaying important matters, and of course, deception. Chase says systemic corruption drives citizens to extremes. And I want to quote what she says. Trump's upset victory resulted partly from Americans' disgust at a rigged system. And then Trump's administration proceeded to put into practice exactly the type of systemic corruption that Americans decry. Corruption to the degree and intensity that we are now witnessing is an affront. It is a threat not just to the democratic principles that we claim to revere, but to the survival of our society. With the events that have transpired in the past few weeks, I find her words to be prophetic. The author provides numerous examples and facts to support her analysis. Che's examples are not always what I thought they would have been, the most obvious offenders or actions. Many were examples from corrupt nations throughout the world. Approximately 20% of the book is supporting notes and citations found at the end. The book is a general survey of corruption in America. I found it to be a slow read because it requires a great deal of thinking, but the content was certainly enlightening and that it's not difficult to understand. The epilogue of the book is titled Breaking the Pattern. Well, we feel powerless and overwhelmed. Cultural taboos that once deterred corrupt behavior significantly in earlier times no longer work. We are not inclined to confront the corrupt system and the many members who cut corners and stretch laws to get and stay rich. Getting rich is powerfully in fashion. Chase urges readers to focus on local actions, including investigating corruption in their own communities and band together across party lines to hold the powerful to account. She suggests using the power of our numbers through consumer choices to not only shop locally, but bank locally as well. Decide where our communities place their value judgments. Chase quoted historian Matthew Josephson when he was referring to the Gilded Age. He said, "And yet, Americans of all classes adulated the super rich, which bathed them in an almost universal esteem, even though they lacked honor, integrity, education, or decent table manners." In conclusion, I want to read a paragraph that Chase writes in the last pages of her epilogue. She says, "We reinforce better values by ceasing to assume that if someone is spectacularly rich, he must be smarter or more hardworking than the rest of us. Instead, we should view such people with suspicion. If there's one thing work on this book has taught me, it is this. It is impossible to become a billionaire without bending the rules and breaking the laws. Most of the members of that class run their operation and lives in ways that injure our communities. Most are trying to rig the system even further. These are not upstanding citizens. They are parasites and freeloaders, however they try to justify themselves, and we do not owe them deference." And then I found another quote just a few days ago that probably is a little bit more succinct, and it's from author and humorist Fran Lebowitz. And she says, "Whenever people say, 'Oh, he earned his money himself,' I always say the same thing. No one earns $1 billion. People earn $10 an hour. People steal $1 billion. Thank you.
Hello again, friends. I'm Harth Tamimi, and for the Wesley Literary Tea, I will be reviewing Robert Reich's 18th book, The Common Good. The book was written in 2018 after the midterm elections. The book is by a veteran liberal that we all know. He served in 3 administrations, best known as the Labor Secretary under President Clinton. He's currently a professor at Cal Berkeley, as well as the chair of Common Cause, a well-known political action group. Really, the book in many ways is prescient of what we see today, in that he's saying what he sees around him in 2018 is what we saw around us and culminating in the insurrection 2 weeks ago, though today we usher in a new administration. Ironically, I'm taping this on the day of the inauguration, and I think it's hopefully, prayerfully, a sign that we are turning the page on what Reich calls a 50-year-long American cultural descent into division, cynicism, and the profit motive exalted. His book has numerous examples dating to the 1970s of stock market manipulators, the most famous of the era, Michael Milken, the greed is good gospel of Hollywood movies and Wall Street, and all of it crashing down in the 2008 banking crisis. Reich says that all of that has led to today's Trumpism, though he's very careful to say that Trump and all that he stands for, and for many of his devotees, as misguided and believing of the lies, that they really are not the cause of this descent, but the consequence of the steady decrease of any belief in the common good, the common weal, and the rise of individualism at any cost with an amoral worldview. So he starts off the book with examples to typify the greed is good gospel. And while many of you may not remember the name Martin Shkreli, I know many of you will remember his story. Born in Brooklyn of Albanian immigrants, he exemplified the greed is good mania of the early millennia, when as a young man he was caught faking drug test results. He then purchased a parasitic disease-fighting drug for unborn babies. That life-saving drug was selling for $13.50 a pill, and he immediately raised it to $750 a pill. He outdid himself in infamy when he purchased the EpiPen company, best known for, again, providing a life-saving injection, primarily amongst children, and immediately raised the price by some 3,500%. Shkreli's arrogance, his mockery of the common folk, his cruelty and his outsized ego, and ultimately his inability to admit any failure, to admit any sense of guilt or remorse or atonement, landed him where he sits today, in prison. Unwittingly, Reich makes the point that he again was just an example, though perhaps an ominous omen for our exiting president. He goes on to detail how many of us remember the banking collapse that ultimately cost the federal government $1.75 trillion in bailouts to the big banks, to Wall Street, to the insurance companies, even in the wake of continued illegality by firms like Wells Fargo in setting up fake accounts in customers' names and pursuing continued shady refinancing schemes. Wright goes into great detail of chasing greed, regardless of the means to get there. And on an individual basis, nobody exemplifies that greed, that arrogance, than the Ponzi scheme of Bernie Madoff. The heart of the book is the common good, its origins, and the restoration of it. The origins of the common good can be found as far back as man has lived in a community. It's mentioned as the general welfare in the preamble to the Constitution. The commonweal is often referenced in verse. The origins of the common good can be traced to ancient Mesopotamia and Hammurabi's Code. Biblical references such as Matthew 25, that what you do for the least of me, you do to me. Political references to the common good are found in England and America from John Locke's theories of the political compact, that governments are formed for the general good of the people, or Thomas Jefferson's borrowing of that notion and other Enlightenment ideas used in the Declaration of Independence. A more modern use of the common good Reich knows from being from Wisconsin. He knows of the progressive movement under the famous Fighting Bob La Follette, Wisconsin's governor 100 years ago, and the various reforms enacted there that swept across the nation, followed by Oregon and California and their progressive governors. Reforms for the common good, reflecting the power of the people, include the recall, the referendum, the initiative, the use of public commissions, the regulating of utilities, the use of experts and following their guidance. Sound familiar? The insistence on public education, which dates all the way back to Horace Mann, and even before that to the Puritan efforts of public education and higher education in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Reich cites the common good working into the 20th century with social reformers like Jane Addams, Jacob Riis, the YMCA, and all of those reforms and efforts to further advance the common good, the public good, influenced President Teddy Roosevelt. So the history of the common good courses through our veins. But not all believe in that. Some, including the famous individualist writer George Orwell, author Ayn Rand of The Fountainhead, have railed against anything but the triumph of the individual. If you can believe it, President Trump claims Rand was his favorite author. No, not that she may not have been his favorite author. I doubt that he has ever read anything. His Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, says Rand is his hero. Uber founder Travis Kalanick is an adherent to the individualism theory. And there is a considerable strain of that Americanism that rails against government, sees the common good as an excuse for what they decry as socialism or excess regulation. In part 3 of the book, Reich breaks down the common good as being the elements of truth and trust and the recognition of the interdependence that leadership must know and sense between the two. Truth and trust are the pillars of the common good, and examples of leaders who have demonstrated that include John McCain and his heroic life both in the military and on the public stage, Al Gore and his grace in a very bitter and contested election conclusion. From the sports world, Steve Kerr, coach of the Sacramento Kings of the NBA, for standing up for players' rights long before we saw other protests. Colin Kaepernick of the NFL, how these leaders presaged what we saw this summer in leading movements aimed at expanding the notion of the common good, the common weal. And he concludes by talking about the difference between honor and shame, and that there is a potential for redemption in the true Christian spirit. I mentioned earlier Michael Milken, the stock market embezzler and manipulator. Today, he's probably best known as a multi-hundreds of millions of dollar philanthropist, particularly in the area of public education. He has other examples as well, but the point is that it is possible to restore honor and shame individually, and it is possible to build a community that is focused on the common good. The importance of truth, the importance of telling the truth, embracing the truth, was never more so relevant than in the era of the hundreds and thousands of lies we've heard, and the consequences of those lies being believed by those desperate for the word that they believe to be the truth. The right solution for this is the restoration of truth and trust and honor. As you might well believe, Reich says the answer lies in the public schoolhouse. An emphasis on civic education, on public education, on the roles and responsibilities of being a citizen. The public schoolhouse is where that is achieved and is paramount. In conclusion, Reich's book is urgent and heartfelt, written in 2018, but certainly I would think he would have to be surprised and shocked by what he saw in 2018 and what has devolved since that book. He concludes with the hope that civic education can be the salvation for saving society as well as our soul. If you're interested in the book, it is rather short. It's a small text, easy to read. It's like a nice comfort food. You know what you're getting from Robert Reich. Until next time, this is Harth Tamimi. So long, everybody.
Hi, my name is Bill Breeding. I'm going to do a review of the book The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again by Robert Putnam and Shailene Romney Garrett. Robert Putnam is a well-known, distinguished American political scientist. He's 80 years old. He's a professor of public policy, I think emeritus now, at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He's written numerous books and is best known for two highly influential books. One, Bowling Alone, published in 2000, in which he argues the U.S. has undergone an unprecedented collapse in civic, social, associational, and political life since the 1960s. And another book, Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis, published in 2015, which looks at issues of inequality of opportunity in school systems in the U.S. His writing collaborator is Shailene Romney Garrett. She's a writer and self-described social entrepreneur and a founding contributor of the Aspen Institute initiative WEAVE, the Social Fabric Initiative. She holds a degree from Harvard and is a returned Peace Corps volunteer. And she's also one of Putnam's students and has turned into a collaborator. The book was published in October 2020 by Simon & Schuster. It's 314 pages long. It has 9 chapters. It's a complex, densely packed book. Has a lot of things to say. So what's the book about? The upswing in the title of the book refers to a period of American history from approximately 1910 to 1964, when the country became more unified, more bipartisan, and was able to accomplish great things on behalf of the country and the average citizens, with two notable exceptions that we'll discuss later on. The book basically asks the question, how did this happen? How can we make it happen again? In order to answer this question, Putnam and Garrett conduct a sweeping analysis of the history of the United States over the past 125 years, from 1895 to 2020. They look at economic, political, cultural, and social trends that occurred during this time frame and come to a somewhat startling conclusion, that America traveled from being a highly individualistic, what they call I society, during the Gilded Age, to become a more we-oriented society during the first 60 years of the 20th century, so from approximately 1910 to 1970, and then reversing course again starting in the mid-60s and going back to an increasingly individualistic I society during the next 50 years, leading us to where we are today. This narrative is laid out in detail in the first chapter of the book called What's Past is Prologue. First, they cite the remarkable similarities between America of the Gilded Age and the America of today. They describe both eras as, quote, highly individualistic societies characterized by deep and accelerating economic inequality, extreme political polarization, a fraying social fabric, and descent into cultural narcissism, all accompanied, as they are now, by unprecedented technological advances, prosperity, and material well-being. Then, they tell us with the advent of the progressive era in the early 1900s, America changed course and embarked on a lengthy era of social reforms that was marked by increasing national solidarity and a sense of common purpose. Putnam writes that by the mid-60s, the Gilded Age was a distant memory. America had been transformed into a more egalitarian, cooperative, cohesive, and altruistic nation. As I mentioned, they refer to this time period from approximately 1910 to 1970 as the upswing and see it as a basis for optimism about our future. But then, starting in the mid-60s, the we culture that had been built up during this upswing begins to reverse, and the country shifts back to a more individualistic I perspective with increasingly negative consequences for the country. In other words, according to Putnam and Garrett, we've been traveling back to the excesses of the Gilded Age over the past 50 years. Yet despite this, the book offers us the hope that if we can learn from the lessons of the early progressive era, which sparked the upswing, we may be able to pivot again away from the individualistic excesses of our age and move towards a more egalitarian, cooperative, and cohesive nation. The next 4 chapters of the book are really the heart of the book and provide a comprehensive analysis of social trends from 1895 to 2020, illustrating what Putnam and Garrett call the I curve, and to support their contention that America and its citizens were substantially better off during the we part of the curve and more conflicted, isolated, and unequal during the I part of the curve. So, for example, at the height of the we part of the I-we curve, you had the lowest gap between rich and poor, most favorable public health indicators, highest social spending on the poor, lowest political polarization, the apex of America's sense of moving forward together, and then these measures decline as the I culture becomes more ascendant. There's a chapter on economics, which looks at the rise and fall of economic equality, a chapter on politics, which looks at the rise and fall of comity and compromise in politics. A chapter on society called Between Isolation and Solidarity, which looks at the rise and fall of cohesion in the social life of the country. And a chapter on culture titled Individual versus Community, which examines the rise and fall of altruism in the cultural values of the country. These chapters are just chock full of graphs and social science tools, as well as historical analysis and current thinking by social sciences. So they offer two major caveats to the we culture they describe in the upswing, and that is the lack of corresponding progress in addressing racial and gender equalities during the upswing. And they examine both disparities thoughtfully and in some detail in two chapters of the book titled Race and the American We and Gender and the American We. They write that addressing racial inequality was not central in the minds of many reformers in the progressive era or in the New Deal that followed. And they quote that the we were constructing in the first two-thirds of the last century was highly racialized and thus contained the seeds for its own undoing. They see progress moving towards gender equality, but assert progress toward racial equality plateaued and essentially stalled after the passage of major civil rights legislation in the mid-60s. They see this shift in momentum coinciding with the nation's moving back from a widening we towards a narrowing I. And that as a result, long-delayed moves and hopes for racial inclusion went unrealized. A full chapter of the book is devoted to the turbulent, game-changing history of the 60s, which they assert was the turning point in the country's pivot towards a more individualistic society. They applaud that a much-needed, liberating expansion of personal rights took place as a result of 60s activism, and that unjust policies were challenged. But they also say that in the long run, this shift came at the expense of building solidarity and a shared sense of national purpose. That it may even have had, in the long run, the unintended effect of elevating selfishness in the culture. It's an interesting chapter, especially for those of us who lived through this period. And yes, it's surprising to learn that in the historical narrative Putnam and Garrett construct, the 60s was just as important a pivot point, in this case for the downswing that occurred, as the early progressive era was for the start of the upswing. The last chapter of the book is called Drift and Mastery and summarizes the author's conclusions. Putnam and Garrett assert that what triggered the upswing was primarily a deep moral awakening by many citizens that shifted attitudes and values about what was important and made future reforms possible. These reformers looked not only outwardly at the appalling social conditions and political corruption of their time, but also inwardly acknowledging their own complicity in allowing these corrupt systems to operate unimpeded. One of the pleasures of the book for me was reading about the many influential reformers from that era: Francis Perkins, Ida Tarbell, Lincoln Steffens, John Dewey, Jane Addams, and the wide range of issues these reformers took on: housing, workers' rights, corporate monopolies, political corruption, the exploitation of vulnerable citizens, and environmental degradation. Other lessons from the early progressive era that they cite as being helpful today include the following. The next reform era must be all-inclusive. As mentioned, many of the early progressive leaders were racist in the sense that their moral circle did not include helping everyone. And as a result, systemic racism was built into reforms that were adopted. At the end of the book, they conclude, any attempt we make today to spark a new upswing must aim for a higher summit by being fully inclusive, fully egalitarian, and genuinely accommodating of difference. Anything else will fall victim once again to its own internal inconsistencies. So some of the other things they advise for a reform era of this day and age, they feel strongly that social innovations must come from the grassroots level, be practical, nonpartisan, and non-ideological. If successful, they will be adopted by others and spread. There should be no master plan. They should spring up naturally. And they give the example of how rural communities in the Midwest came up with the idea of high schools as a social reform during that time, and that it spread throughout the country, and it has benefited the country tremendously. They say, don't wait for charismatic leaders or political parties to act to reform the system. Act locally. If innovative reforms draw widespread support, they will eventually be supported by politicians because it is in their best interest to do so. And they say there must be a strong associational component in reform activities in addition to the social media technology that's so prevalent today. Reformers, they say, need to form interpersonal connections with each other, not just appeals for money on smartphones with experts and lobbyists. So in summary, the short answer the book provides to the question, where do we go from here, is that America needs another major reform era similar to the one that took place during the early progressive era between 1895 and 1920. In terms of my reaction to the book, I did wonder how they could make such sweeping generalizations about such a long period of American history. Could what we've been going through the past 125 years simply be reduced to a recurring cycle of selfishness and common purpose? While I'm not an economist or historian who undoubtedly would be able to subject the author's claims to much greater scrutiny, I found their overall findings surprisingly convincing. And it wasn't just that I'm a 70-year-old person who has lived through much of the time frame they're describing. It was that they backed up their claims with thoughtful analysis and a wide variety of measures. For me, they made the case that the country was objectively better off when we had shared a greater sense of shared community. And they seemed honest and open about the limitations of their methods and findings. In the introduction, they write that the book was not a one-cause causal analysis, but is about narratives that are integrated and instructive. True enough. At times, I felt like I was reading a history textbook, which might imply that it was somewhat dull, but it's a history textbook in the best sense. I found it very well written and extremely interesting throughout. The authors are great guides. Personally, I learned a lot about the early progressive era in the United States that I didn't know. So, in conclusion, it's an excellent book, well worth reading and instructive for these troubled times. 2 thumbs up. I'd like to end with a quote from Theodore Roosevelt, which they use in the book, and it's about what is perhaps the greatest lesson from America's I, we, I century. He says, "The fundamental rule of our national life, the rule which underlies all others, is that on the whole and in the long run, we shall go up or down together." Thank you.
I'd like to start by thanking Annette and Chuck LANSFORD for their leadership and devotion to the annual Wesley Literary Tea. Every year, an exploration of thought-provoking books on a different theme are presented involving a wide variety of reviewers from our congregation and community. I am pleased to be one of those reviewers this year. This year, I was asked to read Long Time Coming by Eric Michael Dyson. Quoting from Wikipedia, he is an academic, author, ordained minister, and radio host. After spending many years at Georgetown University, he now teaches in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and the Divinity School at Vanderbilt University. Described by Michael Fletcher as a Princeton PhD and a child of the streets who takes pains never to separate the two, Dyson has authored or edited more than 20 books dealing with a wide variety of subjects such as Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Barack Obama, Marvin Gaye, Illmatic, Bill Cosby, Tupac Shakur, and Hurricane Katrina. This book examines many of the issues of race. As a device, the author constructs the book by weaving the narrative around letters written to 7 African Americans who have all died unjustly. Each letter stops and starts as Dyson elaborates on issues that confront Black Americans and, in truth, all Americans. As I read the book, I was confronted with the fact that progress is so discouragingly fleeting. I am also chastened by realizing that as a white American, I don't live this experience, and I don't live this experience every day. It is close to impossible for me to understand the depth of the pain in each of these experiences. Even defining unjust deaths as experience seems to trivialize the effect on the collective psyche of Black Americans. But shouldn't it pain each of us? The notion of other and worth being determined by race, really a construct of skin color and surface judgment of circumstances, is deeply troubling. The glibness reflected when we say we are colorblind, to me, is a form of denial. The damage is historic and generational. Saying we have progressed does not answer the systemic racism with roots in slavery, displacement, heritage, Jim Crow, segregation, voting rights, unequal justice, and opportunity. The list is far longer than this. The book will probably make you uncomfortable, as the truth is that the Black and brown experience is not mine as a white American, but collective discomfort by white people is necessary for change. Are we ready to accept this? The book was written in 2020, and the letters to these people bring us to the eruption of unrest with the killing of George Floyd. In reviewing the book, I think it's important to reflect on who each of these people are. Elijah McCain. Elijah McCain, born February 25th, 1996, died August 30th, 2019 in Aurora, Colorado, walking home from a convenience store with iced tea in a bag, a shy, fragile boy. Police were called because he looked suspicious. He was wearing a ski mask. Odd, perhaps suspicious. He was articulate in expressing himself with the police. I am an introvert. Please respect the boundaries that I am speaking. The situation escalated. He was rendered unconscious by a chokehold. Then ketamine was administered by the rescue squad to sedate him as he regained consciousness and became agitated. He died 3 days later. Emmett Till. Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy kidnapped and killed in Mississippi in 1955, allegedly for flirting with a white woman on a dare. Her husband and brother brutalized him, killed him, and threw his body in the river. The body was found. The men were tried, found not guilty by an all-white jury, as truthfully, almost all juries were all white, as the state did not prove the identity of the body. The outrage over Emmett Till and the trial was one of the catalysts to the civil rights movement. Eric Garner. Eric Garner died July 17, 2014, Staten Island, New York. He was stopped by police on the sidewalk for selling single cigarettes from a pack without tax stamps. Arguments with the officers ensued. He is wrestled to the ground in an illegal chokehold. Several officers restrain him face down on the sidewalk. He cried out, "I can't breathe," 11 times before losing consciousness. Left lying on the sidewalk for several minutes before the ambulance arrives, pronounced dead at the hospital. "I can't breathe" became a protest rallying cry. Breonna Taylor. Breonna Taylor died in Louisville, Kentucky on March 13, 2020. She was shot in her apartment when 3 plainclothes officers with a no-knock warrant entered. The warrant was issued because of alleged involvement with a neighborhood drug ring. The warrant was found to be lacking on several counts. Her boyfriend, who was with her at the time, fired a warning shot at what he thought were armed home invaders. The 3 officers opened fire, killing Miss Taylor and firing into neighboring apartments with no regard for public safety. This incident in March 2020 was one of the precipitating factors in the explosion of unrest following the killing of George Floyd later that spring. Hadiah Pendleton. Hadiah Pendleton, a Chicago schoolgirl, died January 29, 2013, shot in the back while standing with friends at a park after school. Gang activity. She was an innocent bystander. She had attended the inauguration of Barack Obama as the guest of Michelle Obama only a week before. This shone a spotlight on gang and gun violence throughout the country. Sandra Bland. Sandra Bland died July 13, 2015, in jail in Waller County, Texas. She had driven from Chicago and was on her way to a new job at Prairie View A&M University, her alma mater. She was pulled over for not using a turn signal as she pulled over to allow the police cruiser to pass. The exchange between Ms. Bland and the officer was heated and escalated and ended with the officer pulling her from her vehicle and arresting her. Parts of the encounter were captured by the dash cam of the officer's cruiser, bystander video, and Ms. Bland's own cell phone. She remained in jail for 3 days and was then found hanged by a trash bag. Clementa Pickney. Clementa Pickney died along with 8 others on June 17, 2015, as Dylan Roof, a vowed white supremacist and neo-Nazi, entered a Bible study group being led by Reverend Pickney at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Reverend Pickney was the senior pastor, local civil rights leader, and longtime state senator representing his district in the South Carolina legislature. Roof was sentenced to death on federal hate crime charges and sentenced to life without parole on state murder charges. He remains in federal prison awaiting execution. This is the order the letters are written in the book. It is not chronological, but instead illustrative of the points that Dyson is making about race relations and problems with social and criminal justice in our country. He examines black-on-black violence and rightly says that painting crime as black on black belies the fact that crime generally happens where we live. So a black neighborhood will have black violence, as a white neighborhood will likely have white violence, although white violence is never referred to as white-on-white violence. The larger issue of de facto segregation in neighborhoods is also illustrative of the issues that Dyson points out. He challenges the notion of the cancel culture. What exactly is cancel culture? Is it a way to dismiss opinion or change promulgated by extreme right-wing perspective? I found that this book challenged my way of thinking on many social justice and race issues. It is not designed to make me feel comfortable. The last chapter is in fact titled White Comfort. I challenge myself and others like me to look outside of that comfort zone. I find the book and others that I have read by Reverend Dyson worth reading. Many of his TV appearances and sermons are readily found on YouTube. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this year's Literary Tea. I look forward to seeing all of you in person. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Tara Swearingen. My review is the book, The Moment of Lift, How Empowering Women Changes the World by Melinda Gates. Melinda Gates initially spends time describing what the meaning of lift is. She describes the time she spent watching rocket launches as a child when her father was an aerospace engineer. That moment of blast-off or liftoff was always an exhilarating feeling and moved you beyond your current state. But if we want to empower women, how does lift happen? What takes us past the tipping point of lift to find another way of being? Gates makes the statement, when you lift up women, you lift up humanity. That sounds good and noble, but is it really true? Sometimes, she notes, it's even just about not pulling women down. The account that immediately came to mind was the op-ed in the Wall Street Journal written by Joseph Epstein. In attacking Dr. Jill Biden for her use of the title doctor, he sought to disempower her. He felt the need to publicly put down and disenfranchise her, a future First Lady who worked very hard to accomplish her credentials and, as Doug Emhoff stated, would never have been written about a man. Given this, we shouldn't be surprised that there are places around the world today where a woman, sometimes because of laws and other times because of cultural bias, can't decide when to have children, whether, when, or whom to marry, decide to attend school, earn an income, walk outside the home, start a business, own property, see a doctor, drive a car, ride a bike, or even, as Melinda Gates did, study computers. The list is long. In the end, what the heroes in the chapters of her book demonstrate is that women have to be spoken up for as a whole to be seen as equals and to build the necessary connections to provide the lift needed. When Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was formally started in 2000, they believed that all lives have equal value, but that in reality, the world wasn't equal and that poverty and disease afflicted some places far more than others. Much of their work is concentrated in Africa. Saving children's lives was the goal that launched their global work, and their first big investment came in vaccines. What they found was that as the mothers stood in long lines for vaccines that they had walked 10 or maybe 15 miles to, bringing all their children with them, was that the mothers really wanted a shot for themselves, contraception. These moms had more children than they could feed. Every mother had lost a child or knew a mother who had died in childbirth. It was a very hard life. Over and over, mothers told her that it was contraception that they needed for themselves, their current children's health, and to break the chain of poverty. This was the first step towards empowerment. As these women began to be heard and gain rights, then their families flourished, and so ultimately did their societies. Gates says that when women can decide when they have children, it saves lives, it promotes health, expands education, and creates prosperity, no matter what country in the world you're talking about. Of all the deaths of children under 5, half come in the first month of life, with the greatest number on the first day. It was determined that mothers delivering needed skilled providers present during delivery. They needed providers that could teach them about the benefits of immediate breastfeeding, keeping babies warm, cutting the cord with sterilized tools, sharing simple practices through a delivery system of care that was respectful, transparent, and listened to the patient. In these cultures, women are on the margins of society. They're outsiders. They have learned not to trust. And once people began to see the success that these programs were having, caregivers were actually sought out, and birth and survival rates were on the rise. But there is always another problem to address. Education is a primary factor in determining who thrives in our world. The lift in education is that it changes your self-image. A girl learns that she is not who she's been told she is, and she gains her voice. Unpaid work goes unaddressed in many cultures. On average, women around the world spend more than twice as many hours as men on unpaid work. Unequal, unpaid work blocks a woman's path to empowerment. They don't control how they spend their time. They can't attend educational or training sessions when their husbands don't allow it. or have the ability to direct household expenses. The staff worked with their constituents towards a more balanced system of shared work. But one of the most disturbing chapters in the book was on child marriage. Girls basically become defenseless and obedient servants sold by their parents for the money and having one less mouth to feed. These parents may honestly feel that this offers a better life for their daughter. This is another practice that is the reason childbirth is the leading cause of death, and domestic violence and genital mutilation is a cultural fact of life in teen and preteen girls. The Gates Foundation field staff quickly learned that they had to overcome cultural norms to be able to include women in agricultural discussions. Once the women saw that they were listened to and they had success, they began talking about additional ways to improve their communities, like better roads, clean drinking water, toilets, and fighting alcohol abuse. Throughout the world, gender bias is a major factor in holding women down, and many times it's also the law. 39 countries have laws that keep daughters from inheriting the same proportion of assets as sons. In Liberia, if the husband dies, the wife has no right to the family assets. In fact, she is the property. Here in the US, we have only one of 5 countries in the world that don't guarantee paid maternity leave, and the only high-income country that doesn't, an opportunity to provide some lift. Religion is another area dominated by men in the world that she touches upon, and many using biblical scripture to justify their exclusions. There are so many areas in the workplace where women don't have a voice. Sexual harassment is still pervasive, as the Me Too movement has shown, as well as the power that exists when women come together to have their voices heard. It's usually the case that the people writing the rules ensure themselves a great share of the benefits and a lesser share of the burden. That's why diversity is essential in a healthy society. In computer programming, it's the saying that it matters who writes the code. They have the power to include or exclude, and there are some excellent examples of that in the book. Another instance of coming together to lift the lives of the marginalized are the sex workers in India that were identified as the best way to impact the HIV epidemic. When the Gates field staff approached them about using condoms, they came face to face with the brutality of their lives as outcasts in society. The sex workers made it clear that it was the fear of violence and losing their lives that kept them from requiring the use of condoms. But a very unique way was found for these women to find their voice. In summary, what Melinda Gates tells us is that you want to make the world a better place, you have to go to the people in the margins and listen to what they need. We have to be willing to bear the pain of our neighbors' suffering, or else in one way or the other, we push those people to the margins because it's uncomfortable for us. We've all been outsiders at one time, at school, at work, or even in our families. But most of us have no idea what it feels like to be wholly excluded. Like the sex workers in India, who are doing the best they can to provide for their children, when the alternative may be very well to see their children die. As Melinda Gates was asked, what would you do to see your children survive? Can you see yourself in these individuals? So equality is a place to start in making women's lives better and contributing to the overall good of humanity. But the supreme goal is a connection where we can see others and we can see ourselves as others, that we can begin to make a real difference and experience the lift that is needed. There was a fair amount of data and statistics shared in this book that I wish had been footnoted. There were things that I would like to know more about, and I was disappointed that I didn't have an easy way to reference it. The other issue that bothered me was one of religion. Gates shared and gave examples of her agree to disagree moments with the Catholic Church she was brought up in regards to contraception and the second-class nature of women in religion. However, at a time when she is asking for courage in others, she doesn't take the Catholic Church to task as hard as I would like in these areas, nor even mention the abuse of children by Catholic priests. Her writing style is conversational in nature, and she shares details of her early life, her work, and her marriage. Certainly, someone that has spent a certain amount of time living in a goat hut in the middle of sub-Saharan country is not usually one who has access to billions of dollars. All proceeds from the book are donated to 12 partnering organizations that she lists in her appendix with the websites. Though through Gates's experiences, she gives many examples of women and men taking a stand and showing courage to move their societies forward. And not just any kind of courage, but courage in the face of women being stoned to death, raped, and ostracized from all they've ever known. It was very moving for me, and her stories can't help but leave an impact on you. It showed me that we are all able to provide lift. In fact, we are the lift.
Hello, my name is Emily Lux, and I was asked to review the book Morality, Restoring the Common Good in Divided Times by Jonathan Sacks. I unfortunately did not like this book. I immediately didn't jive with the title because I don't agree that the common good needs to be restored. I think that we are, yes, living in divided times, but we are living in a country and a world that still believes and works for the common good. So to me, the common good isn't even destroyed enough to be restored. It's still existent. I thought the book was pretty depressing. It was negative focused. I didn't feel like the author provided productive advice, which he constantly said throughout the book that the way to resolve morality is to move from the I to the we. I thought there was a lot of misinformation in this book, and the way that I'm presenting this book review is to give quotes of examples of misinformation that he provides, and then give my take on why I believe that this is misinformation. So there were three common themes in the book that I thought was really oppressive, and I'd like to cover them in this book review. The first is the oppression of women. The second is the oppression of vulnerable groups. And the third is the misunderstanding of safe spaces in academia. Some things that you might want to know about me to understand why I didn't like the book is I have worked 5 years in the trenches of entry-level social work. During that time, I worked with the elderly, with the developmentally delayed population, and with foster care children. After doing 5 years of social work, I earned my MSW and my PhD here at the University of Illinois in social work. And I'm currently an assistant professor in social work at Millikan University in Decatur. My partner and I have been together for 17 years, married for 13. We have one son together, and we relied on IVF to conceive our second child, with whom I'm 18 weeks pregnant with. And those will come together as I critique the book. I wanted to let you know what biases and what lens I was giving this perspective from. So the first issue I had was his insistence on the oppression of women. On page 25, he says, simultaneously with the rise of I over we since the mid-1960s, marriages, families, and communities have all atrophied. Fewer people are marrying. They are marrying later. They are having fewer children. More marriages are ending in divorce. The result is that more people are living alone. In the United States, the proportion of single-person households has more than doubled in the past 50 years. When I read that, I immediately felt like I couldn't trust him as an author. I don't think that marriage patterns in society are a measurement of morality, a fair measurement of morality. With the women's movement, women are getting higher educations and are getting closer and closer to occupying the high-powered careers with equal salaries that they deserve. Because of this, women are marrying later, they are having fewer children, and that to me is a society moving in the right, more moral direction. Women are able to live closer and closer to their truest selves while earning the respect they deserve. The author also talks a lot about divorce in the book, and Divorce, I also believe, is a result of women empowerment. Women are now able to leave marriages. They have their own career and they have their own money. They don't have to tolerate abusive relationships or infidelity. In fact, they don't even have to tolerate being in an unhappy, powerless marriage. Divorce can be healthy, and to me, that is society moving in a more moral direction. The author says, two other quotes on page 27 and 28, "Loneliness is hardly new. It makes its first appearance in the second chapter of the Bible, when Adam finds himself without a partner and God says, 'It is not good for a person to be alone.' As noted above, more people than ever in the West are living alone. Only half of American adults are married, down from 72% in 1960. More than half of those between the ages of 18 and 34 do not have a steady partner." I think this is oppressive to women in a lot of ways. I think the author is saying that the decline of morality is due to loneliness, and that the only way to solve loneliness is to bring back the old-fashioned tradition of marriage. When in fact, I believe there are a lot of ways to resolve loneliness. You don't necessarily have to be in a relationship to not feel lonely. On page 72, the author says, "Sex has been divorced from love, love from commitment, marriage from having children, and having children from responsibility for their care." To me, this is very judgmental against women. Just because sex doesn't always happen in the context of marriage doesn't make it divorced from love. Just because love doesn't happen in the context of marriage doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a loving commitment. And many divorced couples are co-parenting in very healthy manners. Take Vice President Kamala Harris, for example. He goes on to criticize families who don't look like the traditional family that he has in mind. He says more people are cohabitating rather than getting married, and the average length of a cohabitation is less than a third as long as the average marriage. More generally, marriage is fundamental to the moral enterprise because it is the supreme example of the transformation of two I's into a collective we. Again, you can have a committed partnership without the legal formalization of marriage. And cohabitation, in my eyes, is a result of the women's movement. A woman's identity is no longer just confined to marriage and children anymore. On page 106, the author says, a 2014 Gallup report, for example, estimated that the average full-time worker in the United States works 47 hours a week, not significantly fewer than in 1930, when Keynes delivered his prediction, when the average was 48 hours a week. Besides which, half a century ago, only 20% of mothers worked. Today, 70% of American children live in households where all adults are employed. The Skidelsky's argue that the reason is precisely that we are competitive, that we constantly compare ourselves with others. At no level of material wealth will I feel satisfied with what I have, because someone will always have more than I do. I think the implications of this paragraph are very demeaning to women. The reason I choose to work is not because I'm trying to keep up with the Joneses, or that I'm unsatisfied with the few material things that I have, or even that I feel greedy and want more. I work as a professor because it's satisfying. I work because I love my job, and I've loved my career journey. I love bringing my son to work with me and to show these two worlds of mine off to each other. I work to help raise Noah, my son, because raising children in America is expensive. I work to support my family because living in America is expensive. But mostly, I work because I love it. Scott has the financial capital for me to be a stay-at-home mom, but I would not be living life to my fullest if I couldn't do what I truly loved. On page 64, the author says, it is hard to avoid the conclusion that family breakdown must be part of the explanation for the sharp increase among young people of eating disorders, drug and alcohol abuse, stress-related syndromes, depression, and actual and attempted suicides. As a researcher throughout this book, I saw he did a lot of what's called correlation without causation. So just because there are two phenomenon that happen before and after each other doesn't mean that the phenomenon before causes the one that happens after. Those two may be related, they also may not be related. But throughout this book, the author takes two phenomenon and links them as causational to support his own arguments. So his only attribute to the family breakdown really comes from the underlying assumption that women need to return to traditional submissive roles. And he uses research throughout the book to support his arguments, but again, it's correlation without causation. On page 292, the author says, that means that Europe can only maintain a stable or growing population via immigration on an unprecedented scale. The sole sectors of the population that are growing are the religious ones. On average, the more religious, the larger the family. Again, the logic is that of Rousseau. It takes a long-term perspective to willingly undergo the sacrifices involved in having and raising children. To me, this passage is saying he's implying that women choosing not to have children, which is completely within their right, are being selfish. To me, he's tying religion to morality by attributing it to population growth as if that's the only indicator of social morality. Another thing I thought about this book was I thought he was very unrealistic. It's hard being a young adult in this time, in 2021. How are you going to put all these children through college? In this day and age, everyone needs a college degree at minimum. But he completely misses the modern day economy and the impossible burdens of the current day expenses of a college education. And finally, this oppresses women. This argument is devoid of birth control, women working, and women pursuing anything other than marriage and childbearing. On page 72, he says, for a whole variety of reasons, some to do with medical developments like birth control, in vitro fertilization, and other genetic interventions, some to do with moral change, like the idea that we are free to do whatever we like so long as it does not harm others, some to do with the transfer of responsibilities, from the individual to the state, and other and more profound changes in the culture of the West. Almost everything that marriage once brought together has now been split apart. I completely believe the opposite. I think that the emergence of birth control has helped marriage and families because it's empowered women to become closer to their truest selves. Women have more income, more social status, more equality, and that to me is moving towards a more moral society. Another thing that really upset me about that was this idea of in vitro fertilization and genetic interventions having to do with a lack of morality. I was in my PhD program when my husband and I had Noah, and we were blessed to have a healthy pregnancy and healthy delivery. We really wanted to have another child and a sibling for Noah, but I knew I needed to finish my PhD. I needed to do it for myself, and I needed to do it for my son. I did finish my PhD 1 week shy of my 39th birthday, and we immediately started trying for another baby. But because of my age, the journey was emotionally and physically very painful. I was experiencing infertility, and the way that we remediated that was to begin the process of IVF. I went to Indianapolis and had an egg extraction and came up with 2 viable eggs. We could have implanted those 2 eggs, either separately or together, but my husband and I decided to spend thousands of dollars to have the eggs genetically tested. The results came back and we found out that one of the eggs was not compatible with human life. So if that egg had been chosen to implant, I would have ended up with a miscarriage. The other egg had an indicator of trisomy 13. Scott and I decided to implant that egg because it was the only egg we had. And we decided that if the baby turned out to have markers of trisomy 13 in utero, that we would terminate the pregnancy. We consulted with doctors, geneticists, and therapists, And all of us made an informed decision together that it was the most humane and moral thing to do, rather than to bring a child into this world that had no eyes, no nose, and very little cognitive ability. To criticize that very painful time in our lives as a contribution to immorality really made me distrust this author's opinion of morality. In short, I'm a woman that used birth control. I used IVF and genetic testing. I married at age 28 and waited to have a second child until after I earned my PhD. My husband treats me as an equal, and my son knows without a doubt that women are intelligent and capable because he sees it in his mother every day. To me, I am living a moral life, striving always for the common good through my professional and personal decisions. If marriage and disempowering women is how he is defining and measuring morality, it's hard to trust anything he argues in this book. The second problem I had was that he weaved oppression to vulnerable groups throughout his book. On page 72, he says, "The family, man, woman, and child, is not a one lifestyle choice among many. It is the best means we have yet discovered for nurturing future generations and enabling children to grow in a matrix of stability and love." What he fails to miss is that families look different, especially in the LGBTQ+ community, which he completely excludes throughout this book. When he makes these statements, he makes these implications that anything deviant to his expectations and recommendations lacks morality. On page 124, he says, "The state cannot create strong families or supportive communities. It cannot provide children with stable and responsible parents. It can finance schools, but it cannot create inspiring teachers. It cannot generate the work ethic, self-control, and resilience that are vital if individuals are to escape the vicious circle of poverty and unemployment and lead lives of happiness and hope." There were many times in the book where I really had no idea what he was talking about, and this was one of them. First, poverty is not a result of a lack of work ethic, self-control, and resilience. Let's be clear. Poverty is a result of unfair, inequitable policies. He's victim blaming, which he often does in this book, and he's overlooking the fact that the state has a lot of power in resolving all these things he's saying the state cannot satisfy. The state can institute financial and emotionally supportive initiatives that can create inspiring teachers, strong communities, and reduce poverty. On page 136 and 137, he says, "While this was happening at an intellectual level, another development was taking place at a political level in Europe and the United States, multiculturalism. This was a response on the part of governments to the democratic changes in Europe and America brought about by a rise in levels of immigration. I have written elsewhere about why I believe that multiculturalism, embarked on for the highest motives, was a disastrous policy, misconceived and profoundly damaging to the social fabric of every society into which it was introduced. Intended to promote the integration of minority ethnic and religious groups into the wider society, instead it led to segregation. Meant to promote tolerance, it has given rise to new and dire forms of intolerance. It turns society from a home into a hotel, in which each group has its room, but where there is little, if any, sense of collective belonging. This is the first in my lifetime that I have heard someone educated talking about how multiculturalism is destructive and unproductive. I disagree with him strongly, and I think it overlooks a lot. We are currently in society and politics combating a racial divide because we are striving for deeper racial reconciliation, equality, and understanding. This progress will lead to some resistance, but it does not discount multiculturalism. He often talks about identity politics. He has a strong disdain for identity politics. He says, identity politics deepens the fragmentation caused by multiculturalism, adding to it not just culture and ethnicity, but other forms of identity based on gender and sexual orientation. There is a real danger here of the splitting of society into self-segregating, non-communicating ghettos. One of its axioms is that only a member of my group can understand my pain. This is the very opposite of Terrence's dictum, "I think nothing human alien to me." As a person who is non-white and of Asian ethnicity, this really struck me. I don't think people of different culture and ethnicities are self-segregating, but are united not only by their culture and ethnicity, but by their patterns and shared pain of receiving constant discrimination in the United States. When I see another Asian person, I assume that they have received the same discrimination that I have. It bonds us. The truth is, when it comes to communities of color, only those communities can understand their shared painful experiences. The author says, Mark Lilla told students at Rutgers University in 2016, "You cannot tell people simultaneously, you must understand me, and you cannot understand me." And I think this is another example of where the author misunderstands what's really going on in modern politics. What I believe this should say is, you must understand that I have experienced pain at the hands of institutionalized racism, even though you have not experienced it yourself. And I think the author completely misses that point. The author also says, identity politics turns difference into exclusion and suspicion. It builds walls, not bridges. It advocates the hard work of understanding, respecting, and working with and for the people not like us. It encourages a mindset of victimhood and oppression. It abandons ideas of the common ground and the common good. When I read this, the first thing I thought about was the slogan, "All Lives Matter." Recognizing the suffering of one group doesn't isolate them and doesn't reduce the goal of the common good. In fact, it's entirely the opposite. Recognizing the suffering of one group and advocating for them politically includes them in the common goal. The third and final problem I had without the book was that interwoven throughout a lot of the chapters was his issue with safe spaces. He says, a fourth phenomenon in the assault of free speech taking place on university campuses in Britain and America, giving rise to new phenomena like safe spaces, trigger warnings, microaggressions, and no platforming, all designed to limit or ban the expression of sentiments that might offend some students, even if their banning offends others. To an ever greater extent, mob rule is taking the place of what was once the sacred mission of the university, namely the collaborative pursuit of truth. The idea that certain views and people holding them might be banned merely because they might upset someone, which is what is happening in many academic circles today, is astonishing. It's the new intolerance. This is the reason why, in my introduction, I talked about being a social work professor at Millikan. Being in academia, I think that he completely misunderstands what is actually happening as far as the use of safe spaces in academia. I don't think that honest discussions and open dialogues can take place unless there is a safe place. I once, several years ago, conducted a town hall on free speech versus hate speech. And what we concluded was that at the University of Illinois, that you can have free speech. Free speech allows opposing ideas without the oppressive hate speech. The university can put parameters on language and gestures to make campus discussions safe without restricting free speech and opposing ideas. What I felt like when I was reading this book is, as a university professor, the one thing I encourage my students to do is to think critically. I want them to explore opposing ideas. I want them to argue the other side. That doesn't mean that I don't give them trigger warnings and try my best to make a safe space for them. The trigger warnings I provide show respect to students' experiences, and it also builds trust with them, which is crucial to a classroom dynamic. On page 171, he says, one of these concepts is that of microaggression, meaning a slight, trivial, inconsequential piece of speech or behavior that might cause offense, even though it was not intended to. Immediately when I read that definition, I found it to be very dismissive and inaccurate. I pulled up this is the textbook I use for my diversity class. It's the one I used when I taught at the U of I, and it's also the one I use currently at Millikan. And I looked up the definition of microaggression from this diversity textbook that I use. It says, microaggression is verbal slights experienced by those in visibly stigmatized statuses, commonplace interpersonal behavior communicating negative race or sex-based attitudes, subtle personal insults. It's clearly different than the definition that he gives. On page 172, the author says, it is hard to see how the concept of microaggression can be made morally coherent. If I do not intend to offend you, how can I be held guilty for disturbing your hypersensitivity that reads into my words something that was never meant, nor would have been so understood by most people? First, this is victim blaming, which he does a lot throughout the book, but he doesn't realize that impact is greater than intent. You need to be responsible for educating for yourself, and in the learning process, apologize when you need to. Microaggressions are a form of intolerance. It's oppressive, and it keeps universities from providing safe spaces for learning. In summary, as a social work professor and researcher, I've always believed we've been moving from the I to the we, which the author talks about through the entire book. We have progressed in elevating underprivileged groups, fighting for increased visibility, and advocating for equitable rights. Unfortunately, I found this book to be negative, filled with misinformation, and oppressive to women and vulnerable racial and sexual orientation groups. I would not recommend reading it.
Friends, I want to express my thanks for each person who shared with us today in this, our 15th annual literary tea. As always, the quality of the books has been matched by the inquisitiveness and depth of engagement of those who reviewed them. If we have piqued your interest, caused you to think about the future, or allowed you to consider an opinion different from your own, then we have succeeded. Our goal is to bring together a variety of authors and then engage and encourage you to look at something in a new light. Here at Wesley Church and Foundation on the University of Illinois campus, we are a diverse, affirming, and welcoming community. Thank you for participating with us today. I'm Pastor Dan King CREDE, and I look forward to seeing you in person next year.